Before becoming the most powerful queen of drama in Hollywood, Joan Crawford had to do a sordid job in the shadows to survive. She starred in an illegal pornographic film in the criminal underworld, and when she rose to the height of fame, the devils came looking for her. The ones holding the film weren't petty blackmailers, but the notorious Chicago gang of Frank Needy and Bugsy Siegel. This is the chilling story of how the Mafia kidnapped the entire multi-billion-dollar MGM empire, forcing the studio bosses to pay massive mob ransoms just to destroy evidence that could kill America's greatest cinematic icon. She commanded armies of lighting technicians and directors as the undisputed monarch of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. Millions worshipped her. Men feared her. But before the silk, the silver screen, and the Brentwood mansion, she was Lucille Fa Lasser. Born in 1904 into a world that offered her nothing but dirt, she learned quickly that poverty in early 20th century America was not a poetic struggle. It was a physical disease that rotted teeth and broke backs. Lucille grew up scrubbing laundry floors, her hands raw from harsh lye soap, her stomach frequently empty, watching wealthy women pass by in their polished motor cars. She felt a cold knot form in her gut and made a ruthless decision. She would never be poor again. The price of that decision was absolute. Survival strips away morality. Long before the studio machine transformed her into a cinematic goddess, she was just a desperate girl dancing in cheap clubs, taking whatever work kept her from starving. Desperation breeds dark choices. The illicit stag film she made in those early hungry years was an act of raw survival, a desperate attempt to claw her way out of the gutter. But in the morally rigid era of the Hollywood studio system, that dark choice became a ticking time bomb. It was a permanent physical weapon threatening to destroy the immaculate public image she was building. When she arrived in Hollywood, she changed her name and her face. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer was not an art collective. It was an industrial factory that manufactured gods. Louis B. Mayer looked at the tough, ambitious dancer and saw raw material. He ordered her teeth fixed and her rough edges sanded down. Joan Crawford was born in a corporate boardroom, taught to speak with a crisp, aristocratic accent and walk like royalty. She became the ultimate aspirational figure for the American public. She was the working-class girl who made good, portraying women who suffered beautifully in designer gowns. She was a billion-dollar asset, blissfully unaware that her buried past was about to hijack her empire. Joan Crawford built her towering empire directly on top of a fault line. She slept in a silk bed, but her mind was always running. She knew the brutal mathematics of the studio system. Hollywood traded in the illusion of purity. A female star was required to be an untouchable goddess. A single rumor of impropriety could derail a career. Whether the rumors of a stag film were true or merely a phantom weapon, they represented an immediate death sentence. Publicized, the public would turn on her. The studio would drop her and the moral decency leagues would ensure her films were banned from every theater in the country. She lived with a ticking bomb in her past. As Joan Crawford rose to the pinnacle of global fame, a different kind of empire was expanding in the shadows. Organized crime was mutating. The end of prohibition forced the syndicates to find new streams of revenue. They moved beyond bootleg liquor. They infiltrated legitimate businesses. They took over labor unions. They looked west. Hollywood was a geyser of cash. The studios were generating unprecedented wealth. The Mafia wanted a piece of the machine. They began extorting projectionists and stagehands, but the real money was at the top. The bosses in the East watched the glittering stars on the screen. They knew these immaculate figures were human. They knew humans had secrets. Whispers of a grainy, flickering reel of illegal film featuring a young Lucille Lasser eventually reached the sprawling, violent metropolis of Chicago. In the fragile ecosystem of Hollywood, secrets of this magnitude were currency. The information bypassed street thugs and landed straight on the desk of the Chicago outfit, setting off a chain of events that played out like a cinematic thriller. The outfit was not a gang of street brawlers. They were a highly organized, ruthlessly efficient corporate entity built on blood. Frank Needy had taken the reins from Al Capone. Needy was cold, calculating, and exceptionally violent. He ran an empire of extortion, gambling, and murder. When Needy learned about the film, he did not see a scandalous piece of gossip. He saw a supreme tactical advantage. He possessed the original negative. He possessed the power to annihilate Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's most valuable asset overnight. Joan Crawford maintained her iron grip on her. Career demanding perfect lighting and fighting with directors to preserve her flawless image. Blissfully unaware of the shadow war fought on her behalf, she had no idea that 1,000 miles away, a council of murderers held her fate in a Chicago steel safe. The Mafia did not act immediately. They assessed the value of their weapon. They understood the fragile ecosystem of the movie business. They knew Louis B. Mayer would do anything to protect his investment. Mayer was a tyrant, but he was a tyrant who relied on the pristine image of his stars to sell tickets. If the public saw Joan Crawford in a stag film, the financial ruin for the studio would be catastrophic. The outfit knew they could not simply ask for a small payout. This was the ultimate leverage. This was an opportunity to hijack the Hollywood machine. They prepared to send their most lethal emissary to the West Coast. The collision between the glittering world of cinema and the brutal reality of organized crime was unavoidable. The foundation of Joan Crawford's life was about to crack. Benjamin Siegel stepped off the train in Lowe's Angels. Dressed in a custom-tailored suit, he brought the cold, calculated threat of the Chicago outfit directly to the West Coast. He was handsome enough to be a leading man. He possessed a smile that disarmed and eyes that promised immediate violence. He did not come to Hollywood to attend parties. He came to collect. He brought a small metal canister in his leather briefcase. Inside that canister was Lucille LeSure. Inside that canister was the destruction of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. The studio system was a house of cards built on public perception. The American public during the Great Depression paid dimes to sit in dark theaters and worship flawless deities. The studios embedded strict morality clauses into every contract. An actor could be fired for a divorce. An actor could be suspended for a public argument. A drunken night out could end a career. A stag film was not a mere breach of contract. It was an apocalyptic event. It would trigger the wrath of the Catholic Legion of Decency. Priests would stand at pulpits across the country and condemn the studio. Theaters across the Midwest would refuse to project the roaring MGM lion. The financial infrastructure of the entire company relied on the pristine, suffering, noble image of Joan Crawford. Louis B. Mayer sat behind a massive desk in Culver City. He was a volatile, controlling man. He ruled his empire through a combination of weeping paternalism and ruthless vengeance. He believed he owned his actors' body and soul. He dictated their diets. He arranged their marriages. He forced them into exhausting production schedules. He believed he was the most powerful man in California. He was wrong. The men who controlled the illegal liquor networks, the underground gambling rings, and the execution squads of the East Coast held the true power. Mayer operated a business. The outfit operated a war machine. Mayer did not handle the dirt himself. He employed a man named Eddie Manx. Manx was a former bouncer from New Jersey. He held the official title of general manager. His actual job was crisis management. If a starlet got pregnant, Manx arranged the illegal quiet medical procedure. If a leading man killed a pedestrian while driving drunk, Manx bribed the local police and found a willing fall guy to take the prison sentence. He operated a shadow police force within the studio walls. He silenced the press. He made insurmountable problems disappear before the morning papers were printed. Siegel did not contact Crawford. He did not send her a threatening letter in the mail. Extorting the actress directly was amateur work. She collected a weekly salary. The studio controlled the vault. Siegel contacted Manx. The criminal and the fixer recognized each other immediately. They spoke the same brutal language of leverage and consequence. They met in a quiet, secure room far from the soundstages. Siegel did not waste time with pleasantries. He placed the metal canister on the table. He explained exactly what it was. He detailed the quality of the negative. He provided the specific time frame of the recording. He made it clear that this was not a bluff. Manx had to be sure. He took the reel to a private screening room deep within the studio lot. He locked the heavy soundproof doors from the inside. He threaded the projector himself. He turned off the lights. The machine warred in the darkness. The grainy black and white footage flickered onto the screen. It was raw. It was undeniable. There was no clever editing. There was no stunt double masking the face. It was Joan Crawford. She was younger. Her face was slightly softer. Her eyes carried the desperate, hollow hunger of her poverty-stricken past. But it was her. Manx watched the reel in dead silence. He watched a billion-dollar corporate investment turn into a lethal liability. He stopped the projector. He removed the film, his hands. Remained steady, but his mind raced through the bleak mathematics of the situation. Manx walked into Mayer's office. He did not knock. He delivered the news with clinical precision. He did not use euphemisms to soften the blow. He told Mayer that the Chicago outfit possessed a pornographic film starring their top box office draw. Mayer reacted with predictable theatrical fury. He screamed. He wept. He threatened to call the police chief. Manx let the studio boss exhaust his rage. Then Manx laid out the stark reality. The police could not help them. The police were on the studio payroll for fixing local traffic tickets and hushing up fist fights. They were useless for waging war against a national, highly organized crime syndicate. If they brought in the authorities, the existence of the film would enter the public record. A trial would become a media circus. The secret would be out. The outcome would be exactly what they were paying to prevent. While her execution was being negotiated in a smoke-filled office, Joan Crawford was working on stage 15. She wore a tailored wool suit designed by the studio's top customer. The shoulder pads were sharp enough to cut glass. She stood under blistering hot arc lights. The temperature on the sound stage hovered near 100 degrees. Sweat prickled under her heavy, suffocating theatrical makeup. She did not complain. She did not break character. She demanded a fourth take. She demanded a fifth take. She was obsessed with the angle of her jawline. She was obsessed with catching the exact glimmer of light in eyes. She micromanaged every aspect of her physical performance. She yelled at a grip for moving a shadow a fraction of an inch across her face. She felt totally, absolutely in control of her environment. She believed her relentless work ethic made her untouchable, oblivious to the fact that her career was entirely at the mercy of backroom deals. Mayer and Manx sat in the quiet office. The screaming had finally stopped. The cold calculation began. They could not abandon Crawford. She was scheduled to carry their entire slate of romantic dramas and melodramas for the next 5 years. Firing her on moral grounds would cost the studio millions in lost revenue, broken contracts, and wasted pre-production costs. Keeping her and letting the film leak would cost them the entire company. They were cornered. Chicago outfit had perfectly engineered the extortion. They had trapped the biggest predator in the Hollywood jungle. Siegel returned for the second meeting. He sat across from Manx. He did not ask for a favor. He delivered a non-negotiable demand. The price for the negative was exorbitant. It was a sum of cash that could build a small neighborhood. It was not a casual shakedown. It was a ransom designed to bleed the studio's secret reserves. Siegel smiled. He knew Manx had no leverage. He knew Mayer was terrified of public ruin. The mobster casually lit a cigarette in the pristine executive office. The smoke drifted toward the ceiling. It was the scent of a hostile takeover. The Mafia had officially entered the movie business. They were not financing pictures. They were holding them hostage. The logistics of moving that amount of untraceable currency required total secrecy. MGM maintained a slush fund for emergencies. This fund was built on creative accounting, phantom payrolls, and off-the-books cash transactions. It was the money used to bribe judges and pay off blackmailers. But this demand dwarfed standard payoffs. Manx had to liquidate assets without drawing the attention of the studio's board of directors in New York. The board cared only about profits. If they discovered Mayer had allowed a liability like Crawford to jeopardize the stock price, they would replace him. Mayer had to hide the extortion from his own corporate superiors. He was fighting a war on two fronts. Crawford finished her scene. She walked back to her dressing room. It was a luxurious suite, larger than the apartments of most American families. She sat in front of the brilliantly lit mirror. She wiped the heavy grease paint from her face. She looked at her reflection. She saw the high cheekbones and the fierce, determined stare. She saw the product she had painstakingly built over years of starvation and ruthless ambition. She did not see the terrified girl in the basement. She believed that girl was dead. She believed her wealth and her fame were impenetrable armor. She poured herself a stiff drink. She reviewed her script for the next day. She planned her wardrobe. She planned her public appearances. She operated under the absolute delusion of safety. Manx prepared the drop. He gathered the cash. He packed it into nondescript leather bags. It was heavy. It was the physical weight of a human life and a corporate empire. He arranged a meeting location far from the glamour of Beverly Hills. The transaction had to happen in the neutral dead zones of Los Angeles. Manx was a tough man. He was used to dealing. With thugs and hustlers, but he knew the men working for Needy and Siegel operated on a different level of violence. If the deal went wrong, there would be no police rescue. There would be a shallow grave in the desert. The studio executives waited. The machinery of MGM continued to grind forward. Cameras rolled. Extras hit their marks. Directors yelled action. The fantasy factory churned out its product while its foundation cracked. Mayer paced his office. He drank heavily. Looked at the promotional posters lining his walls. Crawford's face looked down at him from a dozen different angles. She was his creation, she was his property, and he was currently paying an astronomical sum of money just to keep her from turning into ash. The meeting took place in the dead of night. Manx arrived alone. He brought the bags of cash. The representatives of the Chicago outfit arrived in a dark sedan. No words were exchanged. The protocol of high-level extortion relies on silence. Words are evidence. Actions are final. Manx handed over the heavy leather bags. The mobsters counted the stacks of bills. They checked the denominations. They ensured it was untraceable currency. Satisfied, they handed Manx a heavy metal canister. It was identical to the one Siegel had brought to the first meeting. Manx took the canister. He did not open it to check the film in front of them. Clear's throat. He knew better than to accuse them of a double cross in an isolated location. He took the canister, turned his back, and walked to his car. Manx drove back to Culver City. The streets were empty. The city of illusions was asleep. He drove straight to the studio lot. He went to the industrial incinerator used to destroy ruined sets and excess film stock. He did not go back to the screening room. He did not need to see the footage again. He opened the heavy iron door of the furnace. The heat blasted his face. He tossed the metal canister directly into the roaring flames. He stood and watched the metal turn red. He watched the highly flammable celluloid inside ignite. The film burned with a fierce, bright intensity. The chemical smoke drifted up into the California night sky. The evidence of Lucille Lesure's desperation was reduced to toxic ash. Manx reported back to Mayer. The transaction was complete. The negative was destroyed. The crisis was averted. Mayer breathed a sigh of relief. He poured a drink. He believed the nightmare was over. He believed the immense wealth of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer had successfully purchased the past. He believed they had outsmarted the mob by simply paying the bill. The next morning, Joan Crawford arrived on the lot. She stepped out of her chauffeured car. She waved to the studio guards. She walked with the brisk, arrogant stride of a woman who owned the world. She went to makeup. She went to wardrobe. She stepped onto the sound stage. She hit her marks. She delivered her lines with flawless emotional intensity. She was entirely unaware that her life had been bought and paid for. In the middle of the night, she continued to build her legacy on top of a secret she thought was buried forever. The ash inside the studio incinerator cooled to a fine gray powder. Eddie Mannix stood before the heavy iron door and stared at the residue of a massive financial transaction. The celluloid was completely gone. The metal canister was a warped husk of blackened tin. He had done his job. He had protected Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. He had protected their most valuable female asset. He closed the iron door and walked back out into the blinding California sun. He lit a cigarette. He drew the harsh smoke deep into his lungs. He did not feel the relief of a man who had won a war. He felt the cold, creeping dread of a man who had just paid the first installment of a lifelong debt. Manx knew criminals intimately. He had grown up with thugs and extortionists in New Jersey. He understood their psychology. He knew the fundamental rules of the underworld. A man like Benjamin Siegel did not cross the country to surrender his only weapon. The Chicago outfit did not operate a charity. They operated a monopoly on fear. They did not sell the cow when they could perpetually sell the milk. Manx could never be entirely certain if the canister he burned contained the only copy or if the rumor itself was just an elaborate bluff. But in the brutal mathematics of Hollywood blackmail, authenticity did not matter. The mere perception of ruin was enough. The men running the rackets in Chicago were ruthless businessmen. They would never hand over the original negative. They had simply sold the studio a very expensive copy. Louis B. Mayer sat in his cavernous office feeling the intoxicating rush of victory, believing he had successfully purchased the past and closed the transaction. Yet the underlying truth remained absolute. The studio system operated in a state of profound vulnerability. The moguls believed they owned their star's body and soul. Yet Hay lived in constant terror that a single unsubstantiated shadow from the past could burn their glittering empires to the ground. Joan Crawford arrived on set precisely at dawn. She was a machine fueled by black coffee and raw ambition. She submitted to the brutal regimen of the studio makeup department. Clear's throat. They pulled her hair back with painful force. They applied thick layers of grease paint to mask any human imperfection. They sculpted her cheekbones with harsh contouring shadows. She stepped into a custom-tailored gown that restricted her breathing. She walked onto the sound stage with the posture of a reigning monarch. The director called for action. She wept on command. She suffered beautifully under the blistering heat of the arc lights. She delivered her lines with a desperate intensity that captivated the camera lens. But she was an animal of survival. She possessed a visceral instinct for danger. She began to sense a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the studio. She noticed it in the executive dining room. She noticed it in the corridors of the administration building. The men in the tailored suits looked at her differently. Mayer did not look at her with his usual paternalistic pride. He looked at her with a thinly veiled resentment. He looked at her like a piece of damaged machinery that cost too much to maintain. Crawford reacted the only way she knew how. She worked harder. She punished herself physically. She restricted her diet to clear broth and dry crackers. She exercised until her muscles screamed. She demanded extra rehearsals. She fought with lighting directors to ensure her face was illuminated with absolute perfection. She believed she had to justify her existence every single day. She operated under the terrifying assumption that if she slipped for a single second, the studio would discard her. She was compensating for a sin she thought she had buried. She did not realize the studio executives were not judging her acting ability. They were calculating her ransom. The nightmare did not end there. A few weeks after the initial payoff, Manx received a phone call on his private unlisted line. The voice on the other end was flat and devoid of emotion, stating a location and a time. His darkest suspicion was confirmed. The canister he burned was a prop. The extortion was not an event. It was a subscription. Manx drove to the designated location. It was a nondescript diner on the outskirts of the city. He sat in a vinyl booth and waited. A man he had never seen before slid into the seat across from him. The man did not wear a tailored suit like Siegel. He looked like a blue-collar worker. He carried a folded newspaper. He slid the newspaper across the table. Manx did not touch it. He knew what was inside. The man spoke quietly. He explained that the Chicago outfit required a monthly contribution to their operational fund. He suggested a figure. It was a staggering amount of money. It was a continuous bleed on the studio's finances. The man made it explicitly clear what the payment secured. It secured the continued safety of the original negative featuring Lucille Lasser in a damp basement. The man did not make a threat. He stated a business proposition. If the studio failed to make the monthly contribution, the negative would be accidentally leaked to a prominent gossip columnist. Manx drove back to Culver City. He bypassed his own office and went directly to Mayor. He locked the doors. He delivered the news. He watched the powerful studio boss physically deflate. Mayor slammed his fist on the desk. He cursed Siegel. He cursed Needy. He cursed the entire city of Chicago, but his rage was impotent. He was a man used to breaking contracts and ruining lives with a single phone call. Now he was the victim of a contract he could not break. He was bound to men who did not care about box office receipts or moral clauses. They cared only about untraceable cash. Mayor authorized the monthly payments. The slush fund was drained and replenished through increasingly creative accounting measures. The studio officially became a silent partner with the American Mafia. The money flowed out of California and into the coffers of the Chicago outfit. It financed illegal gambling operations. It bought corrupt politicians. It paid for bullets and hitmen. Joan Crawford's face on the movie posters was indirectly funding a national syndicate of murder and extortion. Crawford continued to reign. Her films broke box office records. She won awards. She received thousands of fan letters every week. She bought more diamonds. She bought more mink coats. She constructed an impenetrable fortress of glamour around herself. But the foundation of that fortress was built on a lie she could not control. Siegel even occasionally visited the MGM lot. He did not need an appointment. The security guards waved him through the gates. He walked among the massive sound stages. He watched the crews building elaborate sets. He watched the directors screaming through megaphones. He eventually strolled onto the set where Crawford was working. He stood in the shadows behind the camera equipment. He wore a sharp suit and a relaxed smile. He watched the actress deliver her lines. He watched her cry on cue. Crawford finished the take. The director called cut. She turned away from the camera and looked toward the darkness behind the crew. Her eyes met Siegel's. She did not know his name. She did not know he was a ruthless killer. But she saw the way he looked at her. It was not the adoring gaze of a fan. It was not the calculating look of a studio executive. It was the cold, proprietary stare of an owner examining his livestock. A sudden chill ran down her spine. The temperature on the blazing hot sound stage seemed to plummet. She broke eye contact and hurried back to her dressing room. She locked the door. She sat in front of her mirror and stared at her reflection. She could not explain the sudden, overwhelming wave of terror that washed over her. She poured a stiff drink with trembling hands and desperately tried to rationalize the sudden terror. She convinced herself the panic was merely a symptom of physical exhaustion from the grueling studio schedule rather than a genuine reaction to a stranger lurking in the shadows of the set. But her instincts were sharper than her logic. Her body remembered the basement. Her body remembered the desperation of her youth. The presence of Benjamin Siegel on the MGM lot was a physical manifestation of her inescapable past. Her inescapable past had finally tracked her down and stepped out into the bright California sun. Mayer's resentment toward Crawford grew with every monthly payment he authorized. He could no longer look at her without seeing the massive financial hemorrhage she represented. He began to treat her with undisguised cruelty. He criticized her appearance. He gave her inferior scripts. He actively tried to break her spirit. He wanted to punish her for the situation she had inadvertently created. He could not punish the mobsters, so he punished the victim. Crawford fought back with the only weapon she possessed. She delivered flawless performances. She turned mediocre scripts into box office gold through sheer willpower. She refused to be broken. She believed Mayer was just testing her resolve. Unaware of the studio's true motives, Crawford misinterpreted their hostility. She fought back with flawless performances, desperately trying to secure a position that had already been secretly compromised. The psychological toll of the invisible extortion began to manifest in her behavior. She became notoriously difficult on set. She demanded absolute perfection from everyone around her. She fired makeup artists for minor mistakes. She screamed at wardrobe assistants. She developed an obsessive need for control in her immediate environment because she instinctively felt a total lack of control over her actual life. Her off-screen reputation became legendary for its ferocity. The press called her a diva. The crew called her a monster. They did not know her aggression was a desperate defense mechanism. She was an animal backed into a corner, lashing out at shadows. Crawford sat in her Brentwood mansion. The house was silent. The servants had gone to bed. She walked through the immaculate empty rooms. She looked at the expensive artwork on the walls. She looked at the perfectly arranged furniture. She had achieved everything she set out to do when she left Thury's and the cheap dance halls. She was wealthy beyond imagination. She was famous beyond reason, but she felt an overwhelming sense of dread. She felt like an imposter waiting to be exposed. Opening the safe in her bedroom, she stared at the stacks of bound scripts and jewelry boxes before locking it tight. Staring out the window into the darkness of the Hollywood Hills, she understood she was surrounded by predators ready to destroy her without a second thought. She had survived the gutter by being ruthless. She would have to be even more ruthless to survive the pinnacle. She did not know the exact shape of the monster hunting her. She only knew it was out there in the dark, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Joan Crawford was on her hands and knees. It was 3:00 in the morning. The Brentwood mansion was completely silent. The army of maids and cooks was asleep in the staff quarters. She wore a silk dressing gown that cost more than an automobile. She held a bristled brush and a bucket of scalding water mixed with strong lye soap. She scrubbed the pristine white tiles of her bathroom floor. She scrubbed until her knuckles were red and her skin was raw. She scrubbed with a violent, frantic energy. She was the highest-paid female star in the world, and she was doing the work of a scullery maid. She could not sleep. The darkness brought the anxiety. The anxiety brought the memories. She used the physical pain of the scalding water to anchor her mind to the present. She was frantically trying to scrub away the invisible residue of her destitute past. She was trying to obliterate Lucille Lasser. It was a futile war. The trauma of her early poverty, compounded by the constant threat to her manufactured image, manifested in an obsessive lifelong need for control. Louis B. Mayer sat in his office and plotted a corporate assassination. He hated Joan Crawford. He hated her fierce independence. He hated her relentless demands for better lighting and better scripts. But most of all, he hated the monthly delivery of untraceable cash. Every time Eddie Manx walked out of the studio with a leather bag full of money, Mayer felt a piece of his empire being carved away. The extortion had fundamentally altered the psychology of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. The studio was no longer a sovereign state. It was a vassal territory paying tribute to a foreign army. Mayer decided to devalue the asset. If he could not kill the extortionists, he would kill the hostage. He orchestrated a whisper campaign. He used his immense leverage over the entertainment press. He planted stories. He fed the columnist vicious rumors about her difficult behavior. He wanted to break her public image. He wanted to make her toxic. In the spring of 1938, a devastating article appeared in the trade papers. It was an open letter published by the Independent Theater Owners Association. It branded a select group of highly paid actors as box office poison. Joan Crawford was at the top of the list. The article stated her films no longer justified her massive salary. It was a public execution. It was a calculated corporate maneuver designed to strip her of her power. Mayer sat back and waited for her to resign. He waited for her to break. He underestimated the survival instincts of a woman who had clawed her way out of the gutter. Crawford read the article in her dressing room. Clear's throat, she felt a cold, familiar terror. It was the same terror she felt when she danced for pennies. It was the terror of extinction. She knew Mayer was behind the label. She knew the studio was turning on her. She did not weep. Weeping was a weakness she reserved entirely for the camera. She fired her agent and immediately hired a new one. She marched straight into Mayer's office and aggressively demanded a completely new contract. She demanded better directors. She refused to be discarded. She fought with a savagery that unnerved the studio boss. Believing she was merely battling Mayer for artistic respect, she unwittingly fought to maintain her value in an extortion racket she knew nothing about. The monthly payments continued. Eddie Manx grew older and heavier. The stress of managing a shadow empire of crime was destroying his health. He developed ulcers. He drank heavily. He carried the moral rot of the entire studio system in his briefcase. The Chicago outfit did not just collect their money and remain quiet. They expanded their grip on the movie industry. They saw the success of the Crawford extortion and applied the methodology on a massive scale. They sent two brutal enforcers named Willie Bayoff and George Brown to Los Angeles. These men did not target individual actors. They targeted the vital infrastructure of the business. They took over the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees. They controlled the projectionists, the carpenters, the electricians, and the camera operators. The outfit held a gun to the head of every major studio in California. They threatened to call a nationwide strike. They threatened to shut down every movie theater in America. They demanded millions of dollars in kickbacks. Louis B. Mayer and the other studio mogul capitulated. They paid the union bosses. They paid the bagmen. Clear's throat, they handed over briefcases of cash in hotel rooms and dark alleys. Hollywood was entirely subjugated by organized crime. The glamorous premieres and the sparkling award ceremonies were a glittering facade masking a vast criminal enterprise. Joan Crawford was just the first brick to fall in a total structural collapse of studio autonomy. Benjamin Siegel continued to navigate the high society of Los Angeles. He was untouchable. He threw lavish parties at his mansion in Beverly Hills. He invited the very executives who were secretly paying his syndicate millions of dollars. The hypocrisy was absolute. Siegel smiled at Mayer across crowded ballrooms. Mayer smiled back. They drank champagne and discussed the weather. Underneath the polite conversation was a current of pure lethal violence. Siegel knew he owned them. He treated the studio heads with the casual contempt of a warden observing his prisoners. His presence in Los Angeles was a deliberate message from the outfit. The Chicago outfit was planting its flag in the California soil, but the web of extortion surrounding the movie industry began to unravel. Federal investigators started looking into the union corruption. Willie Bayoff and George Brown were indicted for racketeering. The massive scale of the studio payoffs was exposed. Louis B. Mayer and other executives were forced to testify in federal court. They admitted to paying the mobsters millions of dollars to prevent strikes. They portrayed themselves as victims of a vicious shakedown. The government dismantled the union extortion racket. Boff turned state's evidence and testified against his former bosses. The impending federal hammer blow sent shock waves back to Chicago on March 19, 1943. Facing a guaranteed federal prison sentence, Frank Needy shot himself in a Raylard. The head of the snake was dead. The federal investigation did not uncover the Crawford negative. The union extortion was a broad industrial crime. The Stag film was a surgical, highly classified blackmail operation. It existed off the books. It was managed by men who would rather die than speak to a federal prosecutor. The studio executives did not mention it in court. They knew that revealing the blackmail would destroy Crawford and shatter the studio's remaining credibility. The secret remained buried in the ashes of the incinerator and the dark vault of Chicago. Crawford's career at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer began a slow, agonizing descent. The box office poison label was difficult to shake. Mayer assigned her to mediocre projects. He gave the best scripts to younger actresses. He wanted to humiliate her into quitting. Crawford endured the punishment. She took the terrible roles and acted them with desperate brilliance. She tried to elevate the garbage she was given. She worked 18-hour days. She collapsed from exhaustion. She was hospitalized for physical depletion. She returned to the set the next day. She was driven by the terrifying belief that if she stopped moving, she would die. The invisible pressure of the hidden extortion manifested as a relentless punishing perfectionism. She alienated everyone around her. She became a tyrant on the set. She demanded absolute obedience from the crew. She was trying to assert control in a world where she actually had none. Clear's throat, her personal life disintegrated under the strain. She married leading men. She divorced them. She adopted children. She treated her children with the same rigid, terrifying discipline she applied to her career. She demanded absolute perfection from them. She punished them severely for minor infractions. She was projecting her own deep-seated terror of failure onto her family. She was raising them in a militarized zone of flawless appearances. She could not give them love because she had traded her capacity for love for a steel-plated armor of survival. Her home was a museum. Clear's throat, it was beautiful and cold and entirely devoid of human warmth. The turning point arrived in 1943. 18 years after she walked onto the lot as a teenage extra, Joan Crawford was finally fired by Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. Mayer summoned her to his office. He did not yell. He offered a fake paternalistic smile. He told her the studio was moving in a different direction. He offered to buy out the remainder of her contract. It was a dismissal. It was an eviction from the only kingdom she had ever known. Crawford accepted the buyout. She maintained her composure. She walked out of the administration building with her head held high. She instructed her chauffeur to drive her off the lot through the back gate. She did not want the press to see her leave. She retreated to her sprawling home and firmly locked the heavy doors before drinking heavily in total isolation. She felt the terrifying abyss of failure opening up directly beneath her feet because she was rapidly approaching 40 years old. In the cruel mathematics of Hollywood, she was obsolete. She believed her career was over. She believed she had finally lost the war. She did not know the extortion traveled with her. The Chicago outfit did not care about studio logos. They cared about the asset. As long as Joan Crawford was a public figure, the negative held value. When Crawford left MGM, the responsibility for the monthly payments did not vanish. It shifted. The outfit possessed a network of informants within the industry. They tracked her movements. They waited for her to land. Crawford did not stay defeated for long. She possessed a terrifying resilience. She spent months plotting her resurrection. She signed a contract with Warner Brothers. Jack Warner was a different breed of studio boss. He was a street fighter. He produced gritty crime dramas and fast-paced thrillers. He did not care about the pristine MGM glamour. He signed Crawford for a fraction of her former salary. He gave her a dressing room and ignored her. Crawford sat in her dressing room for 2 years. She rejected every mediocre script they sent her. She was waiting for the perfect vehicle. She was waiting for a role that mirrored her own brutal understanding of the world. She found it in a script called Mildred Pierce. It was a dark, cynical story based on a novel by James M. Kine. It was the story of a working-class mother who sacrifices everything to elevate her ungrateful, vicious daughter. It was a story of survival, betrayal, and the corrosive nature of ambition. Clear as throat, Crawford read the script and knew it was her salvation. She fought for the role. She tested for it. She stripped away the heavy glamour. She played the character with a raw, wounded ferocity. She understood Mildred Pierce because she was Mildred Pierce. She understood what it meant to sell your soul piece by piece to climb out of the gutter. When Jack Warner cast Crawford in the lead role, the shadow machinery of the underworld reactivated. The Chicago outfit contacted the executive offices in Burbank. The message was identical to the one delivered to Eddie Manx years earlier. The location had changed. The victim had changed studios. The extortion remained absolute. Warner Brothers was forced to pick up the tab, beginning to siphon funds into the invisible pipeline. They paid the blood tax to protect their new investment. Joan Crawford was once again a billion-dollar hostage. The production of Mildred Pierce was a battleground. Crawford fought with the director, Michael Curtis. Curtis did not want her. He thought she was a washed-up diva. He insulted her on set. He tried to break her. Crawford absorbed the abuse and channeled it into the performance. Used the humiliation. She used the exhaustion. She poured decades of suppressed terror and rage into the camera lens. She delivered a performance of astonishing depth and darkness. She was not acting. She was bleeding on screen. The film was released in 1945. It was a massive critical and commercial triumph. The public embraced the darker, older Joan Crawford. The box office poison label was shattered. She had orchestrated one of the greatest comebacks in the history of entertainment. She was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actress. The night of the Oscars was the culmination of her entire existence. It was the ultimate validation. It was the absolute proof that she had conquered the world, but the fear remained. It was a cold parasite wrapped around her spine. She was terrified of losing. She was even more terrified of the public exposure. She claimed she was suffering from a severe case of pneumonia. She refused to attend the ceremony at Grauman's Chinese Theater. She stayed in her Brentwood mansion. She lay in her massive bed. She wore a flawless silk nightgown. Her hair and makeup were done to absolute perfection by a studio team. She lay in bed and listened to the ceremony on the radio. When they announced her name as the winner, she did not jump out of bed. She maintained the illusion of illness. The press rushed to her home. Photographers crowded into her bedroom. They took pictures of the victorious queen clutching the golden statuette in her sick bed. It was a masterful performance. It was a brilliant manipulation of the media. But underneath the silk sheets, she was trembling. She held the heavy gold statue and knew it could not protect her. The Oscar was a symbol of her supreme value. Her supreme value was the exact reason she was perpetually hunted. The men in Chicago did not care about golden statues. They cared about the cash the statue generated. Benjamin Siegel was building his own monument in the Nevada desert. He was pouring millions of dollars of syndicate money into a luxury casino called the Flamingo. He was obsessed with creating a gambling utopia. He was over budget. He was skimming money from his bosses. The Chicago outfit was losing patience with their Hollywood emissary. The syndicate operated on discipline and profit. Siegel was becoming a liability. Siegel's arrogance finally caught up with him. He had stolen too much money. He had disrespected the wrong men. The syndicate ordered his execution. In June 1947, Siegel was sitting in the living room of his girlfriend's house in Beverly Hills. He was reading a newspaper. A sniper fired a military rifle through the living room window. The bullets shattered the glass and struck Siegel in the head and chest. He died instantly. The handsome, brutal architect of the Hollywood extortion was eliminated. Crawford read about the assassination in the morning papers. She did not know the dead man in the photograph was the one who had brokered her invisible captivity. She felt a brief shudder of revulsion at the violence of the city. She drank her black coffee. She applied her makeup. She went to the studio. The death of Benjamin Siegel did not end the extortion. The Mafia is a hydra. You cut off one head and another takes its place. The account was transferred to a new manager. The demands continued. Warner Brothers continued to pay. The silent bleeding of the studio system went on uninterrupted. Crawford entered the 1950s as a titan of the industry. She transitioned into hard-edged thrillers and psychological dramas. She played strong, terrifying women. She became an icon of camp and fierce determination. Her face hardened into a mask of pure sculpted will. She was richer than ever. She was more famous than ever, and she was more trapped than ever. She began to drink heavily. The vodka dulled the sharp edges of the paranoia. She drank in the morning. She drank on set. She drank until she passed out in her immaculate Brentwood bedroom. The alcohol was a slow suicide. She was trying to poison the terrified girl from the basement. She was trying to kill Lucille Lasser once and for all. But the past is immortal. It cannot be drowned. It cannot be burned in an incinerator. It waits patiently in the dark, ready to collect its due. The 1950s brought a slow, brutal death to the golden age of the studio system. A Supreme Court ruling stripped the major film companies of their theater chains. The absolute monopoly was broken. The unstoppable river of cash that had flowed into Los Angeles began to dry up. Television arrived. Families stayed home and watched small wooden boxes in their living rooms. They stopped paying dimes to sit in dark palaces. The immense slush funds maintained by men like Louis B. Mayer and Eddie Manx began to evaporate. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer and Warner Brothers could no longer afford to keep armies of actors on massive weekly salaries. They certainly could not afford to perpetually fund the Chicago outfit. The underworld also shifted its gaze. The new bosses looked at the declining movie industry and saw a dying animal. They moved their capital to the Nevada desert. Las Vegas was rising from the sand. It offered legalized gambling and an endless supply of clean cash. The mob did not need to blackmail movie stars anymore. They were building their own empires of neon and concrete. The monthly extortion payments from the studios gradually ceased. The physical threat against Joan Crawford evaporated. The men who held the original negative either died, went to prison, or simply forgot about a decaying piece of celluloid in a forgotten vault. But psychological terror does not require an active threat to survive. The damage inflicted on Crawford was permanent. She had lived for 2 decades with a loaded gun pressed to her temple. When the gun was finally removed, she did not feel relief. She felt the phantom pressure of the barrel. She continued to operate as if she were being hunted. The extortion had fundamentally rewired her brain. She could not trust anyone. She viewed every executive, every director, and every journalist as a potential executioner. She maintained her iron grip on her public image because she believed it was the only thing keeping her alive. The studios released her from her long-term contracts. She became an independent free agent. It was a terrifying new reality. She no longer had the massive corporate machinery of MGM or Warner Brothers to protect her. She had to fight for every role. She had to negotiate her own survival. She approached the business with the viciousness of a street fighter. She demanded script approval. She demanded top billing. She demanded a percentage of the gross profits. She was one of the first female stars to force the industry to treat her as a business partner rather than an employee. She was compensating for the profound lack of control she had experienced during her years as a corporate hostage. Her search for absolute security led her away from Hollywood and into the arms of corporate America. In 1955, she married Alfred Steele. He was the chief executive officer of the Pepsi-Cola company. He was a powerful, wealthy man who operated far outside the treacherous ecosystem of the movie business. Crawford did not just marry the man, she married the corporation. Clear's throat. She became the ultimate global ambassador for the brand. She traded movie sets for boardrooms. She traveled across the globe attending factory openings and bottling plant dedications. She demanded the exact same deference from the soda executives that she had demanded from film directors. She forced Pepsi to provide private jets. She insisted on red carpets unrolled on the tarmac whenever she landed in a new city. She intimidated the male board members. She used her overwhelming celebrity to dominate the corporate structure. She was safe. Pepsi-Cola did not care about her past. They cared about the massive publicity she generated. She had found a new fortress. She decorated their sprawling Manhattan penthouse with flawless, expensive precision. She threw lavish parties for politicians and business titans. She had successfully reinvented herself once again. Clear's throat, she was no longer just a movie star. She was a corporate queen. The safety was an illusion. Alfred Steele died of a massive heart attack in 1959. Crawford was left a widow. She soon discovered that Steele had financed their lavish lifestyle with borrowed corporate money. She was drowning in debt. The Pepsi board of directors attempted to force her out. They wanted to erase her from the company. They underestimated the woman they were dealing with. Crawford refused to step down. She fought a vicious proxy war. She leveraged her public image. She threatened to drag the company through a humiliating media circus. The board surrendered. They appointed her to the board of directors. She became the first woman to sit on the board of a major American beverage corporation. She had stared down a room full of powerful men and won. But the victory required an immense expenditure of energy. She was exhausting herself trying to maintain the facade of absolute power. She needed money. The corporate board seat did not pay enough to sustain her lifestyle or clear her debts. She had to return to the one thing she knew how to do. She had to return to the screen. The landscape of Hollywood in the early 1960s was unrecognizable. The glamorous romantic dramas were dead. The public wanted grit. They wanted shock. Crawford was nearing 60 years old. In the cruel mathematics of the film industry, she was invisible. The leading men she used to romance were now playing opposite actresses 30 years her junior. She was offered nothing but supporting roles as bitter mothers or aging spinsters. She refused to fade away quietly. She found a script based on a psychological horror novel. It was called Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. It was a grotesque, terrifying story about two aging sisters trapped in a decaying Hollywood mansion. One sister was a crippled former movie star. The other was a psychotic former child star who tortured her. Crawford knew the script was explosive. She also knew it required a co-star of equal magnitude to generate the necessary box office heat. She approached her oldest and most bitter rival. She went to Bette Davis. The rivalry between Crawford and Davis was legendary. It had been fueled for decades by studio publicists and gossip columnists. They represented two entirely different philosophies of acting. Davis was a trained stage actress who prided herself on raw talent and a willingness to look ugly on screen. Crawford was a manufactured studio product who relied on sheer willpower and immaculate glamour. They despised each other, but they were both aging women discarded by the industry they helped build. They needed a hit. They agreed to make the film. The production of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane was a psychological war zone. The director, Robert Aldrich, deliberately stoked the tension between the two stars. The set was fueled by genuine hatred. Crawford played the crippled sister Blanche Hudson. She spent the entire production confined to a wheelchair. She was subjected to physical and emotional torture on screen by Davis. The role required Crawford to strip away the flawless mask she had spent her entire life perfecting. She had to look old. She had to look vulnerable. She had to look terrified. She CH-nailed her deepest lifelong traumas. She weaponized the fear of poverty, the crushing control of the studio system, and her own relentless paranoia, pouring a lifetime of suppressed horror into the character of Blanche Hudson. When B. Davis served her a dead rat on a silver platter in one of the film's most famous scenes, Crawford's reaction of pure visceral panic was not entirely acting. She was accessing a deep well of trauma. She was weaponizing her own suffering. The film was released in 1962. It was a massive global sensation. It cost almost nothing to make and generated millions in profit. The public was morbidly fascinated by the sight of two former Hollywood goddesses tearing each other to pieces on screen. The film revitalized Crawford's career. She was back on top of the box office, but the victory came with a terrible price. She was no longer a glamorous romantic lead. She was branded as a horror icon. She spent the rest of the decade starring in increasingly cheap and lurid suspense films. She played axe murderers and psychotic ringmasters. She was performing a grotesque pantomime of her former glory. She was selling her own decay for a paycheck. The alcohol took over completely. She drank vodka constantly. She poured it into water glasses and drank it straight. It was the only thing that numbed the relentless grinding pressure in her skull. The alcohol destroyed her judgment. She alienated directors. She fought with co-stars. She became a liability on set. The discipline that had defined her entire existence evaporated. She was finally breaking. The iron will that had carried her out of days and through the extortion was crumbling under the weight of time and chemical dependency. Her relationship with her adopted children deteriorated into total estrangement. She had raised them in an environment of impossible standards and rigid control. She had projected her own terror of failure onto them. When they failed to meet her expectations, she punished them with a cold, terrifying cruelty. She cut her eldest daughter, Christina, and her son, Christopher, out of her will. She disinherited them completely. She erased them from her life with the same ruthless efficiency she used to erase her own past. She isolated herself from everyone who knew the truth about her. She only wanted to be surrounded by fans and sycophants who worshipped the illusion. The 1970s brought the final act of her tragic existence. She retreated to a sprawling apartment in Manhattan. Clear's throat. She stopped making films. She stopped making public appearances. She became a recluse. The apartment was a sterile fortress. She covered all the expensive furniture in heavy clear plastic slip covers. She demanded absolute clinical cleanliness. She fired maids who left a single speck of dust on a table. She scrubbed the floors herself just as she had done decades earlier in Brentwood. She was trapped in a perpetual cycle of trying to wash away the invisible filth. She was a prisoner in a cell of her own design. She refused to let the world see her age. She knew the public only loved the young, flawless Joan Crawford. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her decline. She stopped allowing photographs to be taken. She strictly canceled all dental and medical appointments. She sat completely isolated in the plastic-wrapped apartment and watched her old films on television. She watched the beautiful young woman with the fierce eyes and the sharp cheekbones. She knew that woman was a ghost. She knew the entire mythology was a lie built to satisfy the appetites of studio bosses and mobsters. On May 10, 1977, the struggle finally ended. Joan Crawford suffered a massive heart attack in her Manhattan apartment. She died at the age of 73. Her death was front-page news across the globe. The obituaries were glowing tributes to her immense talent and her unparalleled longevity. The press called her the ultimate movie star. They praised her work ethic. They celebrated her legendary films. The carefully curated narrative held strong. The damp basement was not mentioned. The Chicago outfit was not mentioned. The millions of dollars in untraceable ransom money remained a buried secret. Joan Crawford went to her grave believing she had successfully protected the illusion. She was wrong. The destruction of her legacy did not come from the Mafia. It did not come from a leaked stag film or a corrupt studio executive. The destruction came from inside her own house. 1 year after her death, her adopted daughter Christina published a memoir. It was called Mommy Dearest. The book was an unprecedented assassination of a Hollywood. Christina detailed a childhood of horrific emotional and physical abuse. She wrote about the alcoholism. She wrote about the psychotic rages. She wrote about the wire coat hangers used as weapons of discipline. The book shocked the world. It shattered the immaculate facade Joan Crawford had spent her entire life building. The public was horrified. The fierce, determined heroine of the silver screen was instantly recast as a child-abusing monster. The book sold millions of copies. It was turned into a highly successful and widely mocked film. Joan Crawford was reduced to a camp caricature. The phrase "no wire hangers" became a cultural punchline. Her reputation was permanently destroyed. Joan Crawford's legacy is defined by a devastating irony. She survived the crushing poverty of her youth and navigated the unforgiving exploitative machinery of the studio system only to replicate that exact rigid control and harshness within her own home. After her death, the meticulously crafted illusion she spent a lifetime defending was shattered by the publication of Mommy Dearest. The ultimate tragedy of her story is not found in studio ledgers or Hollywood rumors, but in the enduring cycle of trauma. She successfully escaped the physical misery of her origins, but she could never escape the survival instincts that eventually consumed Hello.